So welcome everybody to a Tilt webinar with Dr. Florencia Henshaw. We need to talk tech tools and tasks to foster interaction in the classroom and beyond. It's Thursday, the 18th of November, and here in London, it is 8 o'clock, and we know it's a different time all across the world, and we can already see we've got people from everywhere here. The chat will be published afterwards. Everyone will be able to see where you're from, which is great. So, I'm Helen Myers. I'm chair of the London branch of the Association for Language Learning. We're always very grateful to others who've helped us in the past, like, for example, Hikerphilp and Linguiscope. But Joe Dale is the person who's brought us all together. He's done his scouting job. Joe, tell us who you are. I know you're going to tell us who Florencia is later, but who are you?
Thanks, Helen. Well, I'm an independent languages consultant, and I've been doing that for many years now. And since the start of the pandemic, I've been incredibly busy organising Tilt webinars, as well as doing training in departments and for conferences and for language associations. And in the chat, I've put a list of 18 example sessions if you're interested in any sort of support around remote, hybrid or face-to-face teaching using technology for teaching languages as well as across the curriculum. Then do get in touch. There's something for everyone there, and I would love to support you, as I have been right through the pandemic and certainly before that as well, but certainly during the pandemic. I know it's a very worrying time for everybody, and I'm here to help, and I genuinely mean that. But back to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Joe. I definitely recommend Joe. And I can also recommend the Association for Language Learning. Please use this opportunity now to put in the chat if you belong to an association for language learning, whether it's this one, ALL, which is the one for the UK, or any other. Please use this as a time to advertise yourself. Put in the chat that you belong and say how valuable it is to be a member of an organisation. As the Association for Language Learning in London, we put on events and webinars. And if you look on our website, you'll find links. You can now click on webinars. Now you can click on events, because we're having face-to-face events as well. And I'm really excited about this. So here we are. If you look there at the moment, you'll see that next Thursday, we have another webinar, particularly for people who are starting out in their career, a chance where people can just share ideas. For ALL members, we have or if this is open to anybody really, we have what's called a roadshow conversation the following Thursday. But I'm really excited to say that, and anyone can come to London. Really, I think we're all open, aren't we, now for business? So come along to London, come to the South Bank, wonderful BFI, British Film Institution, and that's Institute. And that's the place, a lovely place, right by the walk, right by the Thames. So scene of all of, Love Actually and this sort of thing. So you can come along and see us on the 15th of January, Saturday, and we've got some great speakers, and it'll be just lovely to get together, won't it? So anybody's welcome, and it's not at all expensive. So here we are, over to Joe then to introduce our guest for tonight.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. So we're really delighted that Dr. Florencia Henshaw agreed to speak to members tonight, as well as a truly international audience. We have people from the States, from Brazil, from Australia, coming in live, watching live for the session, which is just absolutely fantastic. I saw Florencia speak, I think, at the IELT conference this year, and was very impressed by her presentation. I've then been following her on Twitter, on her YouTube channel, on her podcast, and she's a bit of a rock star in the educational world in languages for sure. So we're so pleased that we're going to have an hour together listening to the amazing Dr. Florencia Henshaw. So without further ado, over to you, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And we'll do all the questions at the end, so we won't interrupt your flow. You can just go for it, and we're very much interested in learning from you and learning about all your different ideas around tech tools and tasks to foster interaction in the classroom and beyond. Over to you.
Hey, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I am impressed that we have 58 participants and growing, and from all over the world. I am truly flattered. So the topic of today's webinar, as you know, is about interaction. And I'll talk a little bit about the first part that we need to talk, but I want to highlight the part about tools and tasks in the classroom and beyond. So there's going to be a little bit of everything, if you will. And that's precisely my goal. My goal is for you to get at least one idea or tool, or at least perhaps something to think about after the webinar. So I'm not here to tell you how to teach. I'm here just to inspire you to try something new, to maybe use one of my ideas, go for it. Or even if all I do is just to help you reflect on the key aspects of interpersonal communication and how you could make it happen in your own context, in your own classroom, then that would be mission accomplished to me. So let's talk, before we get into all the fun part about interaction, I do think it's important to do a quick review of guidelines for tech integration and how I make my decisions. So the first one is less is more. Instead of thinking that I need to try every tool out there and I have to use 10 million tools in one course, I'm rather picky about the tools that I end up using. The other guideline that I follow is that simplicity and variety are not mutually exclusive. So it doesn't mean that I use only one tool and then I don't look at anything else. I think that you can vary what you ask your students to do. And also sometimes you can incorporate some variety with tools that don't require the students to have accounts. So you have an account, but the students don't need to. You share it with a link, you share it with a code, and it's something easy and quick for the learners to do something different. And perhaps the most important guideline, and I want you to remember this, is that tools do not define you or your approach. So don't feel that just because you don't use that cool tool that everybody's talking about, that doesn't make you a bad teacher or less than anybody else. And it also doesn't define your approach. You can be perfectly communicative and meaningful and maybe never use technology, and that's okay too. So the trend you're going to notice in my presentation is tasks over tools. So I am much more interested in what the students are doing and why, and then we figure out the how, the tool. And that's why if you've ever come to any of my presentations, I always say start with the task, then choose the tool. We need to know where we're going before we decide how we're going to get there. And I see a parallel with language teaching specifically, because tech integration to me is guided by the why, what, and how, right, in general. And we don't want instruction to be subservient to tech tools, meaning that you're not imposed, you have to use this tool and then you figure out what you're going to do with it, but rather you have your own pedagogical reasons behind a particular task you want your learners to do, and then you figure out which tool is going to serve you best for that. And the same with language teaching. When we talk about communication, there is a why, a what, and how, and we don't want content to be subservient to grammar. What I mean by that, as an example, is that if you teach only regular verbs and then what, you're stuck, you need to have a conversation using only regular verbs, that can hinder interaction, right? That can limit interaction. So the same parallel with tech tools. Instead of saying I need to use this tool, I don't know for what, but I need to use it, let's look at it the other way. Let's figure out what we want to do first, and then we figure out which tool would work best. Today's webinar focuses on interpersonal communication, and I'm using some ACTFL lingo, at least in here in the US. Our association, our big association is ACTFL, and they have outlined 3 modes of communication: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. And interpersonal communication is essentially interaction. Now, what is not presented in this webinar, but I think that is definitely linked to interpersonal communication, would be interpretive, right? The input part of it. I'm not going to be talking about that in this webinar, but it is definitely an assumption, right? That this is not day 1 of class, right? Or day 1 of a unit. right? That there needs to be some input before we get it to this part. But what are some key aspects of interpersonal communication? For me, the first one is that it has to be a purposeful, meaningful exchange. And the key word that I go back to for me to think, is this interpersonal or not, is that phrase back and forth, right? And then the other thing that I think is a key aspect of interpersonal communication is that there is an information gap between interlocutors. So one person doesn't know exactly what the other person will say. So if it is something that is scripted and all we're doing is reading a script, that is not interpersonal communication, because I see your next line, I know what you're going to say, right? There is really no information gap. The same with an activity like take turns asking each other questions about the student schedule. And we all see the exact same schedule. So we all have access to the same information. If I ask you, what time does she have math class? I already know the answer. I asked you the question, but I already know the answer myself. So I know what you're going to say. Like there's an expected answer that I already know. So that would be a case where there is no information gap. Another example that it is not interpersonal communication is things like work together to complete the paragraph, right? And then you have student A and student B. And you may be tempted to say, oh, student A, student B, right? Sounds like an info gap. The issue that I have with this that to me is not interpersonal communication is because one learner is essentially just reading out loud for the other learner. This is dictation. And to me, dictation is not interpersonal communication. If you think about it, we could accomplish this task even if I'm not understanding all of the words, right? So I would just start reading, the other person would start reading, and then when we get to a blank, like what word is after of? The other person would say Argentina. Okay, got it. How do you spell it? Okay, got it. Even if I have no idea what the rest of the paragraph said, we were able to accomplish that. Same with ports, right? What is the blank after most important? Ports. How do you spell it? Got it. What if I don't know what port is? Doesn't seem to matter for this task. Right? So this is why to me it's not an interpersonal communication task. Okay, so in the title of my webinar, I said, we need to talk. And the question is, do we need to talk? And the answer is not really, because it is not necessarily oral and asynchronous. If you have ever used social media or even email, you know that you can engage in a lot of meaningful back and forth with somebody in written form and asynchronous, not in real time. So clearly, interpersonal or interaction could happen in a written and asynchronous form. However, for the classroom, I see two main challenges. The first one is the time span, right? Because if it's not in real time, you need to allow for that response time, and then the other person responds, and then the other person responds, and so forth. And this turn taking, right? So that we're not just sending one email after another, right? You kind of have to wait for the other person to respond, and then you respond, and so forth. So sometimes in a lot of classes, that is hard to do, because at some point you move on to the next topic, right? And so the learners are not going back to the same discussion forum, for example, and keeping the conversation that back and forth. What we see a lot, and I do too in my own courses, is the read and respond in a forum, right? And to me, that is not quite interpersonal communication, because it tends to be very much I read your thing, I responded to you, we're done, right? We don't even come back to it. And so to me, that's more closer to presentational with audience participation, right? That's what I would call it. It is not a bad thing. All I'm saying is that it would not be my interpersonal task for that unit. However, I think it could serve as fantastic scaffolding for interpersonal, for interaction later on, because when we're writing something and then we take the time to read what that person said and then to respond what that person said, we have a lot more time to process things and to think about what we want to say. So I think that's good preparation for maybe an synchronous interaction later on. So the rest of the presentation, I have it organized by the type of interlocutor. In a classroom, students can, and I mean classroom in a very general way, in a course, let's say course. In a course, language course, the students can interact with their classmates, they can interact with the instructor, and they can interact with other speakers of the target language. Perhaps something missing here now related to one of Joe's webinars is with chatbots, right? We need to add that, that interlocutor to this list. I don't have it here, but go check out the webinar. I'm sure Joe will share the link on the chat. So the presentation, the rest of the presentation, the ideas are organized by type of interlocutor. So let's start with learner-learner interaction. So students interacting with other students, with classmates. One thing I like to do a lot, and I think that it works well for different levels, is infogap tasks. And infogap tasks are essentially these activities that focus on meaning. And yes, sometimes you are, covertly trying to get them to use a particular structure, but the main focus is to express and understand meaning. One person has information that the other person needs, and there is some kind of a concrete outcome to that interaction. You are able to determine whether you accomplish that task or not. So some examples of infogap tasks, which you can do in breakout rooms, which you can do if you are going to be doing chatting, like writing back and forth, synchronous, you can do infogap tasks that way, and they work very well. One example, the classic example, is the describe and draw. And you can, if you're going to be doing it fully online, you can do something like Jamboard, where the other learner can be drawing and the other learner can be looking at what their partner is drawing so they can guide them, whether they're drawing it correctly or not. Now, I am really bad at drawing, I'll tell you that much, and I don't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable about that. So an alternative could be that you allow them to insert icons or to insert objects, or maybe they have to rearrange a picture. And so they are not actually drawing themselves, but rather manipulating pictures in the screen. Follow directions, so you can do a map as the background in Jamboard, and then one learner is given directions to the other learner who needs to follow it and then indicate where they ended up. Spot the differences. Spot the differences as an infogap task implies that the learners work in pairs and they have similar yet different pictures, and each person has only one picture, and they have to work together to describe the picture so the other person can spot the differences between the pictures. You can, of course, tweak it. We do it in an online course where the students meet in larger groups, so they don't meet in pairs. And so we send them via email different pictures. And so they're working in their breakout rooms, talking to each other. But the task is not to spot the differences, but to spot the similarities between all 3 or 4 pictures, in their group. Another, I don't know that is a task necessarily, but I like it, so I'm still going to talk about it. An infogap activity would be a 2-way crossword puzzle. So you have the crossword puzzle, the grid with the words, but one student only has half of the words in the grid. The other student has the other half of the words. And so they have to define, describe, explain those words to each other so that they can complete the crossword puzzle. And I think it's a great activity for circumlocution, right? To help explain something without using that particular word. And then it's also good for spelling, right, when they're completing the crossword puzzle. Of course, good for vocabulary too. And then another example of an infogap task, which is perhaps a little bit more elaborate, if you will, is a shopping task where one student is the customer, one student is the sales clerk, and you can give them a situation. For example, the customer is a traveler, your airline lost the luggage, and so you have to come up with items that you need to purchase, and you have this amount of money, and then the sales clerk has to put together what items they have in their store and how much they cost, and then they interact with each other and see how many items the customer is able to buy. A different type of task that I think works very well with intermediate and up. It could work sometimes with novice, but novice learners are going to need a lot more help. So decision-making task, I would reserve for intermediate and up. So these are tasks where the learners have to reach a consensus. They all have to come to an agreement on something. And usually it involves some type of restrictions or challenges, and then they have to present the outcome, the decision that they made. And so this is a nice segue between the interaction, the interpersonal, and then the presentational mode where they share it with the class. And I think decision-making tasks are fantastic for collaboration between learners and creativity, especially if what they have to decide is creative. So what are some examples of things that they could decide or work on? So the classic example is a dinner party. Right, so they're throwing a hypothetical dinner party, their ideal dinner party. The example is in Spanish, but I can translate very quickly. So in step one is individual, and they have to choose which 4 famous people they would invite. And then in step 2 is when they're talking, but here comes the restriction. There's only room at the table for 10 guests total, including themselves. So they have to negotiate and make their case as to why they would invite one particular famous person. And then they have to also decide where they would sit. And the students sometimes know like the different feuds between the celebrities or who would want to talk to who. What food they would serve, what drink, whether some of the guests would require special foods, what type of music they would play, what activities they would do, or games they could play to entertain the guests, etc. Another alternative would be for them to create a course, right? So you could set it up as the university or the school is thinking of expanding course offerings, right? And so we want a new course that would be attractive to these students, or that would include this type of component. Maybe it's got to include something to do with the community, right? So you said different restrictions. They're not restrictions, but things that they need to be keeping in mind. And then they create their ideal course. I've done that with intermediate low students, and they're extremely creative. I mean, some of the courses they came up with, I was like, we need to propose this to the university right now. So sometimes just they have so much creativity and fantastic ideas that I love seeing that come alive when they are interacting. And the other example, which I think it's always tons of fun, especially the part that comes after the interaction, right? When they're presenting to others, is to pitch a product, to pitch a company, pitch a new club at school, right? So they have to come up with, you know, what problem would you be solving? How much would it cost? What would you call it, right? They have to put together a presentation, a pitch of a particular product, and then the follow-up when they share with everybody, then the investors decide which product to invest in, and it's fun. Okay, more breakout discussion ideas. If you're not a fan of tasks, that's okay. Other ways in which you can get discussion going in breakout rooms, just at least to do something different than, okay, now go and talk. And this probably maybe better for intermediate, but not necessarily. I think some novice learners can also handle it. So one idea is the 5 minutes of fame. So each student is in charge of the discussion for 5 minutes. So they have to keep the conversation going for 5 minutes. And then it's somebody else's turn to be the leader, and they can switch topics, that's okay. But one person is the leader and they get those 5 minutes of being the facilitator of the conversation. And to me, that's important because sometimes students are so used to us giving them the questions or the prompts that, you know, they need to think for themselves, you know, what am I going to ask them, or what kind of follow-up question can I ask my classmates based on what they just said. The other idea would be the this or that, which is a lot of fun. And if you're using Zoom and breakout rooms, one thing that you can do to make sure that you control the slides, where you put a choice like cats and dogs, tea or coffee, movies or books, right? Whatever you want, right? Like just two, there's only 2 choices and you have to choose one. That's the trick, right? You have to choose one. And then, so you display them, you can display them on Pear Deck. And then that way, everybody sees your slides, but they are still in breakout rooms and you control the slides. So you don't have the issue that a lot of us struggle with in Zoom, that if you're projecting something in the main room, when you go to the breakout rooms, you don't see it anymore. So Pear Deck is a great way of doing that. Okay, so the next type of interlocutor will be the instructor. So how can we do instructor-learner interaction? And this perhaps is easier to think of. So some formats in which we interact with our students are individually, and it sounds fantastic, but how do we do that? Because sometimes we don't have the time to be meeting with each student and having a conversation. Another format is meeting in small groups, which could perhaps be the best of both worlds, because you get more of that one-on-one time, and yet you're not meeting with each and every student, which can be time consuming. And then of course you have the whole class format, which is the most common, where one instructor, 20-ish students, and we're talking. But what I'm noticing is that usually the instructor does a lot of the talking, and then some students participate, but it's not everybody. And it's quite easy for some students sometimes to not participate at all, right? So how can we have maybe some of this whole class interaction happen that is not, you know, the instructor just asking a question, then going one by one by one by one, because that can get tedious too, right? And after you ask somebody, then they just like, okay, I'm not going to pay attention anymore. My turn is over. Somebody else's turn to talk, right? So how can we get them so that they are engaged and paying attention to what we're telling them or asking them? So one way that you can do that in online classes, so not necessarily if you're one-on-one, if they have their own devices, could be something like the describe and draw, but now they're interacting with you. And you can use Whiteboard-Fi. And what Whiteboard-Fi does that Jamboard doesn't do is that you, the instructor, can look at all of their screens, but they cannot see what their other student is drawing. Whereas in Jamboard, they could just slide, you know, to the next, to the left or right, and quickly see what their classmates are drawing. So in other words, there's no way in Whiteboard-Fi for them to just copy what the other person is drawing. And I think that a fun way, so it doesn't turn into a monologue where you're just talking all the time and all they're doing is drawing. You can involve the students randomly, like you call them, to contribute to the drawing. So then you go, okay, Mary, your turn. What do we draw, right? And then so then Mary tells their their classmates what to draw, what to add to the drawing. Great. And then maybe you keep going a little bit, and then you call somebody else, and they have to add an idea of what we're drawing next. another fun, and I think it would be fun for the students, in my case, because I'm so bad at drawing, would be for the students to describe, and you are the one drawing. So you're on the hot seat. And then I think it could be good because as the students describe things, you would ask them questions to clarify, make sure you understood what they said, right? Like, wait, did you mean this or that? Did you mean this color or that, right? So I think that it could be, it could lead to a lot of interaction because you know, right, how to ask them for clarification questions. Something else that I think it's a great way of interacting with students is to do collaborative writing as a class. So if you have a projector in class where everybody can see what you're typing on your computer, the instructor station, and you are all working together to co-construct a summary, a story, a dialogue, maybe something that you want to sell. It's just you're constructing something in writing together, right? And so you scaffold, you guide them. Okay, where can we start? Let's start with the names of the characters. There were this kid, and okay, what's his name? What's right? And so you involve them and they see you type, right? Everybody sees what you're typing on the screen. And what you can do is you can initiate this focus on form or feedback, depending on what they're telling you. So for example, I don't know, if they said I'm trying to come up with an example in English. They have 10 years, right? Instead of they are 10 years old. Okay. When they tell you that, you're typing, you go, oh, they have, are we sure? Hang on, what do we do here for age? What do we need? Right. And you initiate that interaction, that spontaneous focus on form on the spot. It's a way of providing feedback. Obviously you're going to type they are 10 years old. And it's a way for them to get feedback without anybody feeling necessarily, on the spot that you're correcting them. And I think that seeing the language in written form is also a good way for them to be able to process language and for them to focus on form as well. So the interview, whether it is individual or small interaction with the instructor, to me is invaluable. I understand the challenges. I understand the challenges. But if there's any way that you could make it happen. So for example, if you are able, at least in my case, I teach in college. And so we are able to say, let's meet, and we can meet via Zoom at a time that is convenient for you. So there's flexibility. Or instead of having class, we're going to have these individual or small group meetings with the instructors, with the instructor. And I think that it is so valuable because you can have more of that one-on-one or one-on-two interaction with them. You get to know them better. They are more accountable for participating than they would be in a large group setting. And I typically have them between 20 to 30 minutes, usually no more than 30 minutes. For most learners. I don't teach super advanced learners. If they're very advanced, even 30 minutes is probably more than enough. And depends a lot, of course, on their level. If you're doing individual meetings and the students are novice, 15-20 minutes is more than enough, but for groups of 2 or 3, 20 to 30 minutes, I think it's good. And then you have questions prepared. But go with the flow. It's interaction, right? This is not interrogation. It's not like a checklist of questions you need to ask them. Just interact with them. So based on what they're sharing, you can then ask other questions. And I think that this is good, especially for novice level learners, because it's hard to do good learner interaction when the learners just don't have all of that language yet to carry a conversation on their own. They need somebody. They rely on another interlocutor to help them. And so this is where I think interaction with the instructor is fantastic. excuse me. And one thing that I would recommend is to not make it so like, oh, this is a test. This is going to be an interview. You could say that you're meeting with them to get their opinion on something, to get their ideas on something. And obviously you're going to interact in the target language, and you create a purpose for the conversation. And so it could be, for example, to decide or recommend something. So you could tell them that the school is going to be creating a new mural outside on one of the walls, and we need your ideas from the students as to what we would include and where and why, right, and all of that, and what colors, right? And so you lead the conversation and the questions with that goal in mind. A similar thing would be something like volunteering opportunities, and because I teach a course that's called Spanish in the Professions. And so the students learn throughout the course things like qualities, you know, of different professionals, types of professional experience, you know, things like that. But you could, it doesn't have to be that hardcore, right? It could be about, what do you like to do? What do you enjoy doing? Do you have experience with this? Do you like working with animals? Do you like working with children, right? So you ask them different questions, and then based on the information that they're sharing with you, then you make a suggestion like, oh, I think you would be great to be a volunteer to read stories at the local library. Are you interested in that job? And then what I do, because I'm Axel trained, and at some point I'm like, they need to ask me questions. So I'm like, okay, so this is the opportunity, right, to read stories to children in Spanish at the local library. What questions do you have about the position? And they know that in a good interview, you're supposed to ask questions. So they need to come up with 1 or 2 questions to ask me. So they ask, I don't know, what days can I go? Or is it flexible, or whatever? Do I bring my own books? I think somebody else, you know, so whatever questions they have, right, for me to assess their abilities to ask questions. And another similar thing, maybe you're planning a field trip. So you want to know about their interests and where they have been for you to then decide where to go on a field trip. So just different ideas so that the conversation has a purpose that goes beyond, I'm assessing your language skills. No, we're talking so I can learn and I can, you know, tell you what opportunity would be best for you, right? Just kind of take the pressure off of that assessment portion of it. One tool that I would highly, I mean, there's that highly doesn't even cover it, that I would so recommend for simulated interactions. So if you don't have time to meet with your students, but you want to simulate that feeling of asking a question and responding on the spot, not go write it out and memorize it and then you record a video, but actually like, okay, I asked you a question, now answer. But you don't have time to meet with them individually, which I understand. Even if you do, I still recommend it for scaffolding for preparation, is Extempore. And their free version is now unlimited, so definitely check it out. But they, of course, the paid version has some other perks, but the beauty of Extempore, as opposed to something like Flipgrid, if you've heard of Flipgrid, is that the recording starts automatically as soon as they watch your video, or they heard you ask the question, or they read your question. You can also type the questions, which I do for some lower level learners. It helps them because some questions are just too hard to process orally, but they may need that time to think about it and to refer back to the question as they are answering. So there's pros and cons to everything, right? So in this particular one, the screenshot that you see there, the question was something like, I want to, I asked them, I used to ask, I know I asked them several questions like this. One of them was, I want to get more involved in the community and I speak Spanish. What can I do? What do you suggest? The other one was, I want to, which is true. I told them I speak a little bit of Italian and I want to get better at speaking Italian. What do you recommend, or what can I do, right? And they had to say like different ways in which I could practice Italian on my own. So the interaction is spontaneous, right? They don't know what I'm going to ask them, and they're not reading a script, and they're not rehearsing their answers. You can change that setting. That's just how I have it set it up, because that is unique. I haven't found any other tool for free that would allow me to do that. And as much as I love, things like Flipgrid or forums or, video forums and all of that, the issue that I had was that I would get a lot of these rehearsed answers, right? Where they would just, read off a script or whatever Google Translate told them to say. So that Extempore has definitely helped with that. So what could you do in Extempore if you need ideas? Of course, you could do this straightforward Q&A where they're simulating a conversation with somebody. You could also have them describe images, describe pictures, because instead of text, you can insert a picture. So the learner has to describe it on the spot. Of course, you could do a map, and so they have to do different directions, or maybe you ask them for instructions on how to do something. You can have them express agreement and disagreement with different things, and I do that too, right? So I tell them, you're going to see a statement, read it, and then tell me if you agree with this or not and why. And the same with the this or that, right? The this or that game, you can do something like that, and they have to express their preferences on the spot. If you're curious about Extempore and you want to give it a try, but you don't want to share your information with anybody, I don't blame you. You can actually try it out without creating an account, and it is extemporeapp.com. And at least the last time I checked, that was the homepage, and there is a little lavender color button that says try me. So if you click on that try me, then you can sample it as if you were a student. It is a very responsive company in the sense that if you have suggestions, if you have questions, they are always willing to work with teachers in helping you figure things out. So definitely check it out and try it out for free, even with your students, and figure out what works for you and what doesn't work. I'll tell you, for example, when I first tried it the first semester, and I piloted it first because I was like, let's see if this really works. What I noticed is that the learners were not used to this seeing a question and having to answer. And so I was like, okay, mental note, I have to create an assignment that is just credit, no credit, easy questions like what's your name in English, just for them to understand, to get a feel for how the platform works and this pressure of answer, right? I asked you a question, go. Right? Not like go look it up and write it down, but just getting comfortable with express yourself to the best of your abilities. And I don't give them a time limit, so they can, think about it and use circumlocution and sometimes gestures because it's videos, and that's okay. To me, that's okay. They're novice learners and they're trying their best, and that's okay. Okay, interaction with other speakers of the target language. So this is where not all programs can do it, and I understand, but hopefully I can help you at least think about it and maybe find a way that you could incorporate some interaction with speakers of the target language. You have to consider many factors. The main ones would be privacy and safety. You don't want to connect your learners with just strangers online, not even in college. I don't want to do that. In terms of availability, so not all platforms have all languages, unfortunately, or not all platforms may have a lot of speakers of one particular language. And so if you have a lot of students and the platform can only offer you 2 choices on very limited time, it's just not going to work for you, right? So there's things that you need to anticipate. And reliability. I have piloted just about all of these platforms, and some of them are more reliable than others. I don't like it when my students sign up and then nobody shows up. That I understand the frustration that the students feel, or if the platform sometimes disappears right from one semester to the next, and then I have to start from scratch. So all of these things are things that I consider before just going with one platform. And I have piloted just about all of these. Italki is the only one I haven't directly piloted with my students, but all of the other ones, and there's more out there. But I'm happy to talk to you if you have any questions about it. Something like HelloTalk and Speaky are the free ones, and free means free for all. So I would not use those as part of class. Conversify used to be free, now I guess is paid. And they ironed out some wrinkles, let's just put it that way. So I've heard better things about Conversify now than the experiences earlier on. I have had hits and misses with Lingua Meeting, and I have had more negative experiences, so that's why I'm not talking about Lingua Meeting necessarily. Some people have had good experiences, some people have had bad experiences. Talkabout, I have had nothing but fantastic experiences, and my colleagues as well. So I'll be talking about that one. And then I'll be talking a little bit about Boomlang and Language Amigo, which are similar, but they have some unique features that I wanted to share with you. In general, my tips, if you're going to incorporate these types of exchanges, would be first, try before you buy. Absolutely. And I just went through an experience with one platform, I'm not going to say which one, that it just turned out to be bad. It just turned out to be very bad. Things just went very wrong. And so it was a good thing that it was just an extra credit pilot. So the students were okay. And I got the feedback that I needed. And, now we move on, and I'm not going to use it in the future. So I would definitely say pilot these platforms before you are going to assign it to an entire class, or before it is like a major high stakes assignment. No, make sure that you go with something that you really know and that your students have given you feedback on. Definitely is not a one and done type thing. If you just do one exchange with somebody, the students will tell you it was fun, but I don't get it, right? Like what do we do with that? Like maybe it wasn't worth it. But once you do at least 4 exchanges, just their confidence starts to change, their language skills. I don't have any concrete data, but I do think that their fluency improves, and they learn so much more. So definitely, I would say probably not if you're only going to do 1 exchange, but if you can do 3, 4 or more, even better. And then strike a balance between structure and freedom, which is hard to do, and it takes some iterations of the project to figure out the sweet spot. At least to me, it took me a while to figure it out, right? So how much do we want to be facilitating, helping them, preparing them for the conversations, versus crossing that line into controlling, where now they're just reading questions and they feel like they're stuck talking about a topic, right? And everything is like too square, right? You have to let them go with the flow when it comes to these conversations, because that's the beauty of it, right? They're meeting somebody new, and they may have their own questions, which may not coincide with what topic you thought they should talk about. So to me, is a thing of beauty when the learners just take the conversation wherever they want the conversation to go. Okay, so Talkabout is the one I've been using for years, and I mean 7, 8 years. Long time. And I've never had a problem. So that tells you a lot about a company. They offer 30 or 10-minute conversations, different price scales, of course. They offer college and high school, and fantastic tech support. I mean, if the students run into issues, the company sometimes gives them a free conversation or lets them reschedule, or, I mean, obviously within limits, but for the most part, fantastic tech support, very, very easy to use. The platform, very easy. And they do offer grants, at least they're still available. I don't know if at some point they'll take them away, but you can get free codes, so free conversations for you to try it out if you've never used Talkabout in your course. So go to talkabout.com/grants and then apply. They have 2 cycles, one in July and one in November. So it's coming up. And so you tell them about your course and why you want to use it, what you want to look into it or whatever. I don't know the guidelines for the grants. Don't quote me on that, but they have them all on their site. And then maybe you can try it for free with your students. So what we do for Talkabout is what I call the Talkabout project, and it involves several different steps. I'm not going to go into detail about each of the steps, but it's just to give you an idea of how much planning it goes to fully integrate these platforms and these types of interactions within the course, because it's easy to fall into a add-on, right? Like, oh, and by the way, you also need to do these conversations, go practice. And for some students, it feels very much like awkward, like, I don't know, I'm talking to you because I have to, because I'm supposed to talk, but then in class, we're doing something completely different. So try to figure out how you can turn it into a project, not just this add-on that they do. So part of the Talkabout project is preparation. So for example, we have them listen to conversations that from Talkabout. I have downloaded the audio, I have segmented the audio, and I ask them questions just so that they get used to what a conversation sounds like, right? And that helps them feel a little bit better too, because a lot of them think that they're not going to be able to understand anything, and they're like, oh my God, I was able to understand that conversation. I think I'm going to be okay, you know? And then effective preparation, the students are nervous. And it's understandable. So I think it's good to hear them out and to understand what concerns they have and how can we help them feel better about it. More preparation consists of them being familiar with the platform. So we have them explore different profiles of the conversation partners, and they choose who to talk to. We do not impose countries or people or gender or ages or anything. It is completely up to them to choose who to talk to. The only thing that we tell them is to choose for all of the conversations, at least 2 countries. That's it. Just because we want them to get different perspectives on different issues. But if they want to talk to the same person more than once, they can. Topic selection, we help them mainly because maybe this is just me, but I don't want the students asking questions that they could have easily Googled, like, do you celebrate Christmas in your country? Okay, you probably can Google that and maybe find some information. What we want them is to get more of that, you know, first person singular narrative, right? So what do you think about Christmas? Do you celebrate Christmas? You know, like we want to guide them to understand more of those individual layers of culture. And then we have a check-in in class after the first conversation, sometimes after the first 2 conversations, before we keep going. And the things that come up are things like, should I use tú or usted, right? Like the different ways of addressing somebody. Should I, be doing this or that? They asked me this question and I didn't know what it was. Whatever comes up that sort of lingers, right, that they may want to do differently in their next conversations, it's good for us to provide some guidance if we can. Then they do more conversations. And then the last part is the final project. Part of it is in class. We do a discussion on how things went. They share experiences. Sometimes they talk to the same person and they get very excited about that. And it's like, oh, did he tell you about this? Right. So they compare notes on what they learned. And then they have to write a report, or they have different formats in which they can submit it, but written report with images and things like that. Okay, Boomlang. Boomlang is very similar to Talkabout, so it could be another option if for some reason Talkabout doesn't have the language you teach, although I think Talkabout has more languages than Boomlang, but I'm just putting it out there if you want to check it out. Very, very similar, almost identical pricing too. But the one thing that Boomlang has that is a unique feature, and this is what I wanted to share with you, is that they have the option to have a virtual guest speaker for elementary school students. So you can have one guest speaker for the whole class, right? So you set it up like it would be like Skype or Zoom, and then this person comes to your classroom, and so the students can ask them questions, right, and interact in real time in class. So that's one unique thing that Talkabout doesn't have. And then the other platform that I want to talk about briefly is Language Amigo, which was started by Latino entrepreneurs here in Illinois. And we use it for one of our classes. And one thing that I guess is unique or different from Talkabout is that it's the same person at the same time. So instead of the learners choosing, okay, I guess today I'm going to make an appointment with this one, and later on I want to talk to this one, and later on this one, and you know, every person has different availability. What they do is they just say, okay, I'm going to talk on Mondays at 4, and it's Mondays at 4. So it's almost like making a date with your friend, right? A virtual date, and you meet with the same person. They're flexible though. I'm a tough customer. I told them I want them to at least meet 2 amigos, 2 people. And so we do several conversations with one person, and then they meet somebody else for several other conversations. So there's some flexibility, but there is a lot of positives to meeting with the same person more than once, right? Because otherwise, if you meet somebody new each time, which also has pros, right? Because you get more variety. But if you meet with somebody new each time, you almost have that awkward introduction, getting to know each other. I don't know you every single conversation. Whereas, by the second, third, fourth time they met, they know that person, and sometimes they're looking forward, or they share things with them like, oh, I remember you told me this and we saw this in class, right? Like there's that follow-up with somebody else. And they get feedback via email, which some students like. I can live without it. But some students do like the feedback on how they did in their session. And it's not like super hardcore evaluative, you know, like you need to practice conjugation. It's not about that. It's just, I guess, another way of reinforcing the students and about how they did in the session. And for the most part, everybody gets very positive feedback. So some safer alternatives if none of those work for you. I think it's great to connect students with students in other schools. Even that, they are speakers of the language, and they are other speakers of the language. So that's another way that you can do that. You can have virtual guest speakers like the Boomlang option, but maybe it's just a friend, right? A friend in a country where the target language is spoken, and they can just jump in and talk to them, right? And I can be a guest speaker if you want from Argentina, if you need somebody. And then asynchronous interviews, you can do that on Flipgrid because it's great. The students post questions. So it's very short, like, I don't know, where do you live? What do you like about where you live? What do you do, I don't know, for this holiday, or whatever they want to ask them. And then the guest speaker records responses to the students' questions. And then the students can perhaps record a follow-up question to that, right? And then the guest speaker records again. So it just depends on who you know and who's willing to give their time to record answers. But it can be an alternative, especially if you are in very different time zones, right? And maybe the synchronous part is just very difficult to make it happen. It's a good way to let the guest speaker just record their answers when they're available. So, Joe, I told you I would talk for more than 40 minutes. Did I accomplish my goals? Hopefully, yes. Did I inspire you to try at least one new thing, or did I give you some food for thought on things that you can do with or without technology? So hopefully the answer to that is yes. So thank you all very much. And you can find me on Twitter my YouTube channel, Unpacking Language Pedagogy. In the site that I have there, go.illinois.edu/TLTL, which is Technology for Language Teaching and Learning, has a ton of resources and tools, and it even has a section on, it's called Language Learning Apps. And some of them are just apps, but some of them are a lot of these platforms that I talked about today to connect with native speakers. They call them native speakers. I don't know if they're native or not, but that's what they call them. So I'm happy to stay and answer questions if there are questions.
We've got 3 questions, but first of all, I'd just like to thank you on behalf of everybody watching right now. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was absolutely wonderful and inspiring, and I certainly learned about a lot of new tools personally that I hadn't heard about before. It'd be lovely to hear from people in the chat as well if you've used some of these tools. That's absolutely brilliant. We've got 3 questions. But before, 4 questions actually. We were wondering if you were going to share your slides. There's no obligation to do so, but if you could, if you are happy to do so, if you could share them in the chat, we can put all the content onto a web page as well. Helen very kindly puts a web page together for all the presentations that we have. So
yeah. So I'm happy to share a copy of the slides, but also I always share all of my presentations if I'm allowed to share them.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. You can share whatever you want. Absolutely.
You know how that is. I mean, some people tell you no, it was just for us. I'm like, okay. So no, but so my site, and if I can share my screen real quick so I can show you what I'm talking about.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So on my site, if you scroll down, the last one that says presentations and publications has my PowerPoints and then recording links underneath. So feel free to just like scroll and look through it. So I was planning on posting it here, but I am also happy to share
that'd be great if it's
like
okay
PDF
to share the link now in the chat, and then if you can then add the presentation to.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Would that be okay?
Absolutely. Let's do that right now. Hang on.
Thank you so much. We have another Helen Perel, who said, "Can we get you back again to talk more on other topics?"
Yes, I can talk about so many things, Helen.
Yeah. We'll have to have you back. That'll be amazing.
I like talking.
That'd be absolutely amazing. Cool. Right. So we've got a few questions, if that's okay. Let's just make sure. I think I've got all the questions so far, but anyone who wants to put another question or two in the chat, feel free to do so. So the first question was, so relating to interaction with native speakers, the question was, what was the language level of the students?
Right. So the lowest is what we would call novice, high, intermediate, low. So these are students that have had a year and a half of study in college, but some of them, honestly, they did a year and a half, maybe a year ago. So some of them, they take a little break and then they want to keep going. So their level is mostly words, maybe some sentences, maybe some phrases, that they know, but these are not advanced students. And so the people are, the conversation partners are very understanding. And yes, I mean, for a learner like that, it's true that the conversation partner is going to be doing most of the talking, but that, to me, that's still okay. They're still learning a lot. They're getting a lot of input, and that is okay. I do use it also with the intermediate, mid-intermediate, high students. One of them is a conversation course, and some of them are probably advanced. But it's a different beast, if you will, right? So like what we want them to get out of the conversation changes. The platform might not change, but the whole, point of the conversation changes, because now they're talking about, like, I don't know, gender roles or different cultural perspectives on things, right? And so now the conversation partner knows, you can handle quite a bit. So now they ask them, so wait, what is it like in the US? What do you guys do? So now they're expected to produce a lot more complex language. for the lower levels, they know they're not going to be asking them that. So for example, they like some of them do want to talk about things like what does college look like, right? So they ask them like, how many classes do students have to take, right? And so the conversation partner simplified, right? So I took 3 classes, right? You can, they can adjust the level of the language depending on the students, but I would not use it with first year, first semester, like just if they're too new and they're gonna get intimidated. So I would say start by getting them comfortable interacting with you, and then they sort of graduate to talk to somebody they don't they don't know very well. So maybe you can do that in between where you have a guest speaker, but you're there, so you're guiding them through the conversation, so it's not as intimidating to talk to somebody else. Yeah.
Absolutely. And would there be a lot of planning that you'd have to do beforehand, or is it done sort of spontaneously? I'm just thinking for the students that don't have a lot of language, would they sort of prepare something they want to say, or is it more spontaneous that they have topics they want to talk about that they prepared? Yes. Is that how it works?
Yes. And I mean, obviously it was only 1 hour and I didn't talk about everything else that goes in the course, right? So there's obviously a lot of the input and activities and everything else that they did, right? So it's not like on the spot, go talk about this and they don't know how to say it. So everything is connected to whatever we've been talking about. And the students, yes, they're encouraged to prepare questions, but obviously we want the conversation to maintain some spontaneity, because that's the whole beauty of it, right? So it is not, they don't go with prepared answers. That being said, I'm okay if like they want to say something and they don't know and they look it up real quick. That's okay. That's conversation, right? We do that sometimes, ourselves. Even when you're in advanced speaking, you're like, hang on, what was that word? And you look it up. That's okay, right? So things like that, I'm okay with. I told them I don't want perfection. I don't, you don't have to have like the perfectly written question and answer. And they don't know what their partners are going to be asking them or telling them. So there is definitely an element of spontaneity, while still we want them to go as prepared as possible. I have to say it does help a lot with the lower levels. We do Language Amigo where they meet with the same person, so they feel more comfortable. The second time, it's not a stranger. I mean, it's still relatively a stranger, but they have talked to them before, so they know what to expect a little better, and that's part of preparation too.
And for the students taking part in these sorts of exchanges, what sort of age are they? Are they K-12 or secondary, as we say in the UK, or are they older?
So I teach college, so everybody is 18 and older, but these, at least Talkabout does offer it for secondary and college. I don't know their exact age limit. That I don't know what it is, but I know that many of them they don't offer this for elementary school children. The only one, and that's why I mentioned it, was Boomlang, that does this guest speaker, but nobody is talking one-on-one with elementary school children. Yeah.
So on that point, that draws us nicely into the next question, which is from Chris from the chat, saying the platforms look fab, but do you have any concerns around safeguarding, which is a big thing in the UK? With the younger learners, it's a big, he's literally written it's a big issue here in the UK. So what comments would you make around safeguarding and ensuring that you know who you're actually talking to?
Right. So, I mean, I have to say, I understand that it depends a lot on the institution. Even here in the US, right? Different school districts are going to have very different policies in terms of which tools you can use. Like we have even districts that are banning Flipgrid, for example. So I completely understand the precautions that schools need to put in place. So at least in terms of high school and college, so something like Talkabout, all of the speakers have been vetted. All of them are reviewed by students and by instructors. So, I can tell you, since, I've used it for 8 years now, 7-8 years. that's a long time every semester, and I've never had a problem. I mean, that says a lot about the company, and everything is recorded. So you do have access to all of the recordings of all of the conversations. And what I like is that, you know, this is partly their employment, right? Like the natives, the speakers are getting paid. So they want to be on time, they want to be nice, they want things to go well. So, you know, I understand. I feel comfortable with a platform like Talkabout. I felt very comfortable. I have not had issues with Language Amigo so far. And again, I have access to all of the recordings, and the students have said nothing but wonderful, wonderful things. Is it always a risk? Yes. I mean, I don't think any company can give you like 100% guarantee that nothing will ever happen. But a lot of these companies are smart, you know, they have, you know, legal liabilities. I mean, they're not, this is why I would never do, I get very nervous with companies that are setting up exchanges without vetting who is on the other side. That to me is a big red flag that I just don't do, even if they're students. Like, let's set up an exchange with this school. What do you know about those students? Nothing. You just know what, as much as you know about my students, and I know that you don't know a whole lot. So to me, that's a red flag. And I understand, you know, if it's like a friend who happens to teach in another school and you really know them and you trust them and you know, like their students are good, like, okay, do it that way. But companies that randomly, you know, set learners up, to me, that's too much risk. I want them to be vetted. I want them to take it as employment, like seriously, you know what I mean? So that's
really helpful. Yeah,
that's why to me, companies that have an established track record, very important. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I appreciate we're getting on with your time. We've just got another one question, actually, I think, unless there's any other questions in the chat. But the next question was, would love to know more about connecting with students in other schools. We have tried to fix up an exchange pre-pandemic, and that was difficult. I'm sure it's harder now. So what sort of advice would you give around that? Would you say go with one of the companies that you've recommended, or would you recommend, say, connecting with someone who you've got to know over a number of years on, say, Twitter, and maybe seeing if you can have like an informal connection between classes? What advice would you give in that area, Florencia?
It is difficult, and it's been difficult for me. I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't been able to make it happen. I would probably not rely on a third party, on a company to set you up. I would, and this is why it's time consuming. I'm not saying it's easy, but I would try to establish connections and check them out. You know, go to their professional page, make sure everything is legit, go do a Zoom call with the teacher. Like, just, you have to do a lot of this vetting sort of on your own too. So if you know somebody, if you have those connections, that networking with other teachers, I think that can help. And sometimes, you know, if you want to start more locally, so you're not necessarily connecting them, like, let's say you teach in Spain and you want to connect them with somebody who teaches in France, and then you're like, but I don't know anybody, and then it has to be the language exchange, and then the curriculum has to match, right? Like, I understand it's very complicated. So maybe just start with another school. Even if everybody's a second language learner, it is still an exchange, right? They're still talking to somebody new, not just with their classmates all the time. But maybe you meet somebody at a professional development event who teaches near you or in another town, but you know that school, right? So maybe just start with that, right? Even if you're both teachers of Spanish and your students are all learning Spanish, just start with that. Get the learners to have a new audience, so it's not just them, and then figure out what worked, what didn't work, what you would change, you know, to do a language exchange, right? Whereas now half in one language, half in another language. And then, of course, the other thing that you can do is you can do the exchange via email or written, maybe in a forum post, and in a way you can vet the messages before they get posted. It's still a lot of work. I understand that. But if you're truly concerned that you're too scared to have them, you know, video chat with each other, then that can be another way for them just to have a different interlocutor, a new interlocutor. That language exists outside of your classroom.
Yeah, that's absolutely excellent advice. Thank you so much. I totally agree with, and I've known examples of teachers connecting with other teachers in other schools because they both teach the same curriculum and the same language, and it's just a bit different, and it's exciting for the students. I think that's an excellent piece of advice. Thank you so much. So,
and I'm serious. Like, you know, I'm willing to be a guest speaker and talk about Argentina if anybody needs to.
Well, there's an offer. You're gonna have people who'll be banging your door down.
And do that with your peers. You know, it's like do it quid pro quo. All right, like Alejandro, come talk to my students about Panama, and I'll talk to your students about Argentina. You know, like do that where it's not nobody feels like, you know, you're taking advantage of each other's time. Like do it like a contract, yes, or something, like, you know, an agreement with a fellow teacher, and they can be, you know, a guest speaker from another country.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got one last question, if it's okay, because I appreciate time is getting on. I'll pose the question to you, and then feel free to give a short answer or a longer answer to it. But it's almost like an introduction into inviting you back, which I'm sure we'd all love to do. So here's the question. Going back to what you were talking about earlier, it would be great to hear you explain more about the difference between a focus on form and focus on forms, and the impact and acquisition, not today, but in the future. There you go. I've set it up perfectly for you. Not today, but in the future. I think in the UK, we are very much still conditioned to focus on forms and language learning, language as subject / grammatical knowledge. Please enlighten us. So maybe that would be a perfect introduction to the next webinar. If you're happy to come back, that would be absolutely brilliant. Oh, sorry.
Sure.
Helen is clarifying. Helen Perel is clarifying impact on acquisition.
Okay,
sorry. So that's a great question, Helen, and we can give Florencia lots of time to think about it. Maybe not answer it right now, but to think about it for another webinar.
It's a big topic for a 1 hour webinar. And it depends a lot on your goals, let's be honest, right? So if you are tied by certain tests that your students have to take and they need certain knowledge, like it's complicated. But if we're talking about impact on acquisition, okay. That can get interesting, Helen.
Cool. And I know you've talked about your YouTube channel, but I'd really encourage everybody to check out Florencia's YouTube channel.
I have a video on focus on form versus focus on forms.
Excellent. Excellent. That's perfect. So I think at that point I will hand over to Helen Myers, if that's okay. Helen, if you want to wrap us up, give us a few thoughts. But it's been a wonderful hour, more than an hour, and we've still got 35 people in the room, but at the height we had over 60 people, which is great for this sort of like midweek webinar. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And it's late, isn't it? Kind of late. It's
20 past 9 in the UK.
Oh no, we'll be out on the town in the night. Teachers in the UK just going, you know.
Oh, you're gonna go party, huh?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Apparently Laura isn't. So I would say thank you so much. You can see by the comments, and that's where it's love. That is a benefit, isn't it, of a webinar? Because in a normal circumstance, if you're doing it live, you can see people smiling, and at the end everybody claps. But here you'll be able to see afterwards just how much you have inspired people. And I've loved the way that you have talked, certainly that introduction of the fact that we are doing things not because the tech dictates it, but this is what we want to do, and what tech can we use is a message I know that Joe, you're always putting across as well. So it's been fantastic and really good for this time when in fact we're not depending on the tech. We are getting back to thinking about what can we do in the classroom, but how tech can still help us. And you can see by the comments, you've come up with some things that we've had lots and lots of webinars, but you have brought lots of new ideas to us. You've inspired people. So thank you ever so much. So, I mean, it's a bit, I don't know, for anybody who's around now, please, I'm going to make it so that you can start your videos if you want to put your video on so we can just see you. And then I could perhaps take a little picture of anybody who's willing to do that. That would be lovely. But And we can
Who's there? I see Melissa.
A round of applause, everybody. So thank you very much indeed.
Jesus, Marita. Hola, Marita. Nice to meet you.
So you can see people are applauding. So just give
Dorothy
for people to come out of behind wherever they were.
Hi,
Okay.
Oh, it's lovely to see everybody.
There's Dorothy, Jesus, Perla, lovely, Marita. Great.
There was a message on Facebook, Florencia, from Madame Carbonneau, who said that she got her time zones mixed up, and so she was gutted that
I'm sorry, I didn't
you were
just say I
finishing
didn't
up. I said, don't worry, well, I'll post the recording on my YouTube channel. You'll be able to come along. Madame Carbonneau, I'm sure you know her on Twitter.
Yes. Well, I know her from Twitter.
There we are.
How I know a lot of people.
If you put your video on, because I didn't take the picture then, so
we got to pause for the picture.
Going again, that would be lovely. Otherwise,
sorry,
I'll
Helen.
just take pictures of the people who are here. Okay. So, all right, here goes. And 1, 2, 3. Oh, and Helen McFarlane, you just crept in there. I'll do it once again. Are we all looking okay? Yes, everybody had their eyes open. So thank you very much for that. And I'll add that. So that's really generous of you as well, Florencia, to offer to share your slides, because so often that's people are really grateful because it's all of your intellectual property and you've put loads of work into it, but that people will really, really benefit from that, just to be able to have a link to things. So thank you ever so much.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. So when the recording is posted, let me know, and I'll add it also to the site so people can refer to it as well. But I'll share on Twitter, Facebook, everywhere.
Fantastic.
So thank you
I've
very
been
much.
tweeting you. I've been adding you as a username. I've been live tweeting through the session. So when I post the recording, probably tonight, I will.
Very quickly. Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. I've been saying Florencia Henshaw says this. Florencia Henshaw says this.
Oh goodness.
Florencia Henshaw is sharing ideas around this. So yeah, no pressure. It's all good.
Oh my goodness.
And thank you as well, always, I do say at the end, Joe, thank you to you for discovering and sharing the talent that you discover through all of your networks. It really benefits everyone. So thank you ever so much.
Very true. It takes a lot of time to plan these events. So my appreciation, and Helen also, thank you. Thank you for being here, and for the participants. Wonderful questions. I'm trying to scroll through the chat right now to see if I missed any other comments, but I love it. There was a lot of discussion. So that's fantastic.
Yeah. Sign of a great webinar. That's brilliant.
So shall I stop the recording now then, Joe?
Cool.
All right, here goes. Stop the recording now.